welcome to Awkward's Anonymous, where we aim to navigate the awkward, uncomfortable discussions about pleasure and what is our right to getting, having, and experiencing pleasure. So today, me, Tasaffy Hossain, I'm joined by my guests, Anna and Sarah, and we will be talking about how when we are advocating and trying to create spaces to discuss more about the right to pleasure and why pleasure is important when we are talking about sexual and reproductive health and rights. What are some of the ways that we navigate and engage in these discussions around our cultural norms and different perspectives of the different generations in the different contexts that we come from and that we work in. So on that note, we'll just start with a short introduction from Anna first and then Sarah.
Hi, I'm Anna Santos. I'm a journalist. I'm Filipina. I'm based in Berlin. And I write about the intersections of gender, sexuality, and labor migration rights. I'm owning it. I'm also a content creator on sex positive content. I run an Instagram page called Sex and Sensibilities.
Hi, Tasaffy and Anna. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Kaddoura. I'm a Palestinian feminist activist, researcher, writer, trainer, and I have a video channel called Haki Nasawi, which translates to feminist talk in Arabic. And basically, I like to create videos on feminist history, theory, and current critical debates. I've also worked on sexual and reproductive health and rights since 2017, and a big chunk of it is focused on pleasure and consent. So I'm excited for this conversation with you guys.
Thank you. And thank you, both of you, so much for making the time with all our schedules and travels that everyone's been on recently. It's really nice that we eventually managed to fix this time to have this conversation. So just a little bit about me. I'm Tasaffy Hossain and I'm based in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And a big part of our work is to engage and facilitate discussions around gender identities and understanding our own power and privileges. Pleasure, understanding consent, understanding self and desire becomes like a really important part of the conversations that we engage with in the different communities that we work with. And a lot of times it's very interesting because we don't see a lot of space, especially with younger people now, where there is much conversation happening, or like open conversation, which is engaged with really understanding and trying to be able to express their own bodies, whether it is their likes and dislikes, but then also at the same time having all different kinds of messaging coming through the different platforms that they're on from their peers. So it's always interesting to also see how these spaces that we create then engage different groups into having different kinds of discussions, different ways that they try to engage in these conversations. So yeah, I think maybe we can just share a little bit, because we are all working in the South in the context of larger Asia. But I feel like even then there's quite a bit of difference in the specific countries or the specific cultures that we engage with. So just to create an idea of that, like looking back at your own experiences around discussions of pleasure, sexual reproductive rights, and health issues, anything that you would want to share about how you have had to navigate it maybe, or how that experience was in the context that you come from.
Okay, so one thing I can think of, it's an example of, I guess, a belief that is quite common here. I'm based in Lebanon, I think I forgot to mention that. But one common belief that I guess is a bit representative of how pleasure is viewed is this idea that if a woman experiences sex once, she's gonna, I guess it's gonna open a new realm of emotion and sensation for her that she's gonna have to keep going back. So It's like it's a way of trying to restrict or constrain women's mobility or behavior or relationships after their partner dies or after they divorce or even after they are exposed to maybe sexual violence. And it's like a way of trying to curb this mobility by claiming that it is to protect women, it is in their interest to keep them within the private sphere after they have been, I guess, after they have lost their virginity and experienced sex for the first time, because this pleasure is addictive. And thus, in order to protect them, we have to restrain them within certain boundaries.
And for me, I guess when I think about like a situation that would focus on the way that Philippines views sexual reproductive health rights for women, it's like there's this hierarchy. I've always said that there's this hierarchy of what my rights should be. The irony of it is the Philippines ranks so high on numerous gender surveys run by the UN, etc. And that's largely because of the relatively high political participation of women in the Philippines. And I always argue that's just a matter of having dynasty families. It's not a matter of gender. It's not a matter of women or vulva owners being in those spaces and advancing our rights. It's a matter of political dynasty. But there's that view that the Philippines is also queer-friendly. It's in the media for being a very gay-friendly space. So it has this outward sheen of being progressive, being liberal, being queer-friendly. But look at the laws. And these are the laws. Laws tell you what is right or wrong. It dictates how you act, how you see other people as other or as like you. And we're the only country in the world without divorce. The only other place on the planet without divorce is the Vatican. And they're not even supposed to get married there anyway, because they're mostly male residents. So that's moot. We are one of the handful of countries that have the most restrictive abortion laws. Abortion is criminalized. And under no circumstance is it allowed. In practice, this means that when other people talk about it, it's like, oh, do you know where I can get an abortion? We would still whisper about it. We call it the A word. And sometimes I'm like, what A word? My name, Anna? And the list goes on, right? There's non-existent birth control, no sex education. I say, what's the sex education in the Philippines? It's close your legs and pray. We seem to ignore the scientific information that condoms work better than prayer. You can add prayer. I'm not going to diss anybody's religious beliefs. They can work hand in hand, or they should rather work hand in hand is what I should say. But that is in a context of why it's so frustrating to work in the space where you're advancing sexual reproductive health rights, but also necessary, because you have to push back against those who will say, oh, so many women are already working and educated. And so I guess I'll end by an anecdote. There was one gentleman, I don't remember who he is, but we were at a informal luncheon and Women's Day was coming up, March 8th was coming up, and it was a work environment. So we were just talking about Women's Day, blah, blah, blah. And he said, why do you need a Women's Day? What more do you women need? You're here, you're working, you're educated, you're earning a living. What more do you want? And it's one of those scenarios, again, where I was like, oh my God, I wish I could go back to that and answer. I was a little dumbfounded because he had presented himself to me in that work environment as someone who was progressive and pro-gender rights. And sometimes when you're met with discrimination, with racism and sexism in that space, I personally don't feel like I'm prepared to answer it because my guard is down. So I was silent. But I think that now, looking back at that, if I had been asked that, I would have said, you know what? Respect is what we want. Respect is what we deserve. So I wish I had answered that, and I guess this is a redemption for me. Podcast episodes like this are redemption for me for those times when I fell short of defending myself and defending what we do.
Thank you. Yeah, even when Sarah was sharing this issue around women and like this linkage between pleasure and protection. And I was thinking, oh, we have this stereotype, not really a stereotype, more like a norm, but there's little proses around it about how women shouldn't talk really loud, or like a big part being like women shouldn't laugh really loud. If you hear women laughing out loud, that's supposed to be rude and disrespectful and not like the sign of a good woman. And that was just making me think that, oh, if when that comes from this concept of like pleasure not being something that women should really own and take on and embody as something that is core to themselves. If you cannot laugh, like someone outside should not hear you laugh. Yeah. So I think, and the situation is very similar also when it comes to issues like sex education not really existing. There's no, abortion is also illegal in Bangladesh. There's almost no conversation and discussion around it. It's expected that women will have no idea or interest in pleasure and sexuality. So even when we are talking about women in marriages, there's very little conversation about their own pleasure and their own wants. And then outside of marriage, it completely does not even exist. So we end up having and seeing a lot of questions, and also just information around what is supposed to be pleasure for women. And especially with like groups on Facebook, we see a lot of questions and conversation from young women who are newly in relationships or newly married, and just so much worry about how their bodies are not good enough, how they're not orgasming, and they cannot have this conversation with their partners because it will be letting their partners down. It's them not being able to fulfill something. And it feels like at least this conversation is happening with younger people. I feel like even when 10 years ago, a lot of these conversations, even within our generation, was not happening at all. But looking back, it's even more difficult when you try to have these conversations with our parents' generation and try to explain why these are important conversations to have. So yeah, maybe a little bit of sharing, like what kind of challenges or how you feel like some of these discussions have shifted over time, or what are some ways, because we also want people to be able to take ideas to try out in their own context. So maybe some thoughts or ways that work for you when you were trying to navigate these kind of issues.
Anna, do you mind if I go first?
No, please, Sarah, go.
So one thing that I feel we're a bit lucky with in Lebanon and maybe a few places in the Middle East is that in a way, culturally and religiously, at least to Muslims in the region, is that it is recognized that a woman deserves pleasure within the institution of marriage, not outside of it, of course. But it is recognized as a right for the wife, and it is actually one of the bases that you can ask for a divorce, or one of the reasons that you can ask for a divorce based on if your husband is not providing you with quote-unquote pleasure.
I love it.
Yeah. The fact that a pleasure isn't spoken about in the same way and in the same language as maybe our generation today among older generations does not raise the fact that older generations speak about pleasure, even if it's in more maybe indirect ways. Like I can remember the times when I would hear my mother and my aunts, or maybe my mom and her neighbors, talking about what plants they are growing and what these plants do for desire and pleasure and whatever, what they're going to be using, and giving tips for each other. And it's maybe just a more kind of indirect way, but it's still being talked about, and it's still something that is expected as something that a woman needs and something that a woman has. Whether that actually is taken seriously and considered by, let's say, the men in the relationships, that's something else. But I think one thing that changed maybe between my mother's generation and my generation is we're a bit more clear and outspoken about pleasure as a right or as something that is part of our sexual lives when we talk about our sexual lives openly, which is not the case always. But I guess today it's done in a way that is a bit more mainstream, or the language that we use is often in English, or the terminologies, or I guess the construction of pleasure as well is based on certain models that we learn about maybe before we explore pleasure ourselves. Whereas I think with the generation of my mother, pleasure was spoken about and expressed in Arabic and local languages, and maybe practices that are also more local and more maybe rooted in local culture as well, which is fascinating because we associate the discretion that older generation had towards speaking very openly about pleasure as something that is negative, whereas we speak about pleasure in a way that distances it when we speak in English or when we speak in terminologies that are not very local and rooted in local culture, which also creates a sense of distancing ourselves and making the language sound a bit more cleaner rather than like the trashy quote unquote, of course, and more cheap way of talking about sex that we associate to older generation.
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about how I think the pleasure discussion in the Philippines is slowly, but I see the light at the end of the tunnel in terms of shifting the narrative. Although I have to tell you, Sarah, I'm super jealous that you have, there's something that exists that, okay, my husband doesn't know how to give me an orgasm, he's out. That kind of premium or value on a woman's pleasure and enjoyment in matrimony, not just looking at the role of the wife as being a childbearer, which is traditionally what it has been, even in my culture in the Philippines. But yeah, as I was saying, I think that the discussion of pleasure is slowly but surely also shifting. You'll see that I'll continue the discussion on the paradox of the Philippines. I've had friends visiting me, and when we watch normal TV, like in the cafe, there's a free TV airing, noontime show. They'll see these very scantily dressed women gyrating and stuff, and it's a noontime show. And they're like, what is this? No, it's not Netflix, it's not paid TV. This is something that's open to everyone. And because it's in that discussion, sometimes it's always, or most of the time rather, it's very titillating and taboo and just vulgar. But I think that the Philippines also having a very strong media presence in terms of both the actors being there and the use of social media, especially the young people, is really changing that. You see a lot more content creators talking about pleasure. And I am so happy to see that even doctors are talking about pleasure. This was like, oh my God, the young doctors are actually saying that they're talking about consent. They're talking about your right to birth control. They're talking about your right to body autonomy. They're talking about your right to pleasure. Like, you shouldn't even have to doubt yourself about it. It's so much normalizing the conversation, and I like that a lot. I'm seeing that the space is coming together. Doctors who were like, these are the goalkeepers, right? The ones who would say, no, you don't need birth control. I've had friends who have just seen a doctor once in their life because they were shamed by the doctor who, when they asked at 26, I have a boyfriend, we're using condoms, I would like birth control that allows me to have more decision making over the birth control process. And the doctor just looked at her and said, you're too young to have sex anyway, so just abstain. Those walls are coming down, and I love it. I think though that there still needs to be a space where we can democratize that even more, because the internet is still a space where, if you don't have a smartphone, you won't be able to access it. If you don't have a strong internet connection in very remote places, you're not going to be able to access it. But it's there. The demand is there, the space is opening up. And I'll just end by I'll share another story. Just recently, I was in Italy. I was invited by a migrant rights group to speak. And of course, I was so excited. I said, okay, I'd love to go to Italy to speak about migrant rights. And they said, oh, no, actually, we're hoping that you'll speak about sex education and sexuality and its impact on young people. And I was like, oh my God, really? And just to contextualize a little bit, the event was organized by a migrant rights group. So these are older people, these are parents, that's the profile. But it was a youth summit. So they were organizing it for their children who were in their 20s. And I was like, oh my God, the parents were asking for this. And they asked me, and I was like, I'm really honored and I'm really careful that I will not betray your trust. What do you expect from this talk? And I tried to ask them. They didn't know exactly how to articulate what they need, but they just know that this conversation needs to happen. And then on the other side, the kids, I call them kids, they're in their 20s, but they were also like very excited, but didn't want to assert so much what they wanted to know because it was an event arranged by their parents. But I'll tell you, you can imagine, right? You can imagine, but I love this story so much. I think I'll be telling it until I'm a grandmother and talking to my grandcats. But at the actual event itself, because I asked the parents, will you be there during the talk? And they said, oh, we haven't really thought about it. We'll be there for the other talks, which are about migrant rights and the hardcore stuff. And they said, but if you don't want us to be there, it's fine. And Filipino culture coming in, I said, no, I don't want you to feel unwelcome. So let's talk about it when we get there. Okay. On the day itself, right before I started to talk, the organizer asked me, I was already on stage. Right before I had started, he said, can we be here? Can the parents be here? Or should we go? And then my knee-jerk reaction was like, okay. And then I said, oh, no, wait, sir, I'm sorry. Can we ask our participants? And then he said, okay. And I asked them, is it okay if the parents stay? And I could see them looking around each other. And I said, okay, wait, sorry. Let's do it like this. Sir, do you mind if the parents step out for a moment and we'll take a survey among the participants, and then we'll call you back in if they feel comfortable with you staying outside? And they said, yeah, okay. And the kids voted, and of course they all said, okay, we would rather just have this amongst ourselves. Yeah. And it was such a rich discussion in terms of laughing about certain things, not laughing like making fun of, but to discuss a topic that is normally shrouded in shame and blame. Speaking about it like we would talk about it with our friends and sharing it's just very candid. Very honest also. And after that, I thanked them. I thanked the parents. And then I also told the whole group, I said, I've never seen this before. And I think that needs to be recognized. We talked earlier about consent. And this is what it looks like when your parents also give you that space to decide for yourself and the autonomy to do so. And it's not normally something that is very valued in Asian culture and in Filipino culture. Your parents decide for you. And allowing them to do so is a sign of respect. And what I saw that day was respect being given equally. And I think that's also something to celebrate in terms of how spaces around pleasure, around sexuality, and a positive way to talk about it are opening up.
Yeah, I love that story. But Anna, since you already brought up doctors and talking about pleasure or like their take on it, maybe like from your perspective, why would you say a conversation like pleasure is important when we are talking about services being provided, when we're talking about policies? What is your take on it?
I was telling that youth group that I spoke to, of course I talked to them about, they were happy to talk about sex, of course, and pleasure, woo! And I said, why is this important? And I said, for one thing, pleasure is about your body, and everything lives in your body. Your trauma, your joy, your pain, your triumph, your body remembers all of that. So on one level, on one very personal level, that is why it's important. It's to take care of your body. It's to pay homage to that body that you live in. And then secondly, I said, when you are able to decide about your body, you're able to decide about your future and your life. Owning your future starts with owning your body and the decisions that you make about it. I know we know that on that level, but then I like to take it to moving forward. This is what it will mean for the rest of your life. And when you can assert yourself when it comes to your right to say no, whether it's to assert yourself to your right to birth control and planning pregnancies, or your right to pleasure, you can assert yourself in all other spaces. It starts from there. And sorry, can I just say another story too? I like telling stories, as you can see.
Yeah.
I have a child who is non-binary, but they were female assigned at birth. And when they entered their teen years, I was introducing them to the idea of birth control. And I said, do you think we should go on it? And if we do, I'd like to bring you to a doctor friend of mine who can talk to you about it if you don't feel comfortable talking to me about it. So anyway, we got through that discussion and they were on the pill. And so after that, the second thing was to ask, are you going to tell your dad? Their father and I are no longer together. So I said, are you going to tell your dad? And they said, I don't know yet. Do I have to? And I said, no, you don't. But I think you should be prepared, right? And so they came home one weekend after spending the weekend with their dad, and they said, oh, my pill alarm went off. And dad said, what's that? Oh, it's for me to take my pill. And he's, what pill? My birth control pills. And and my kid, sorry, I still stumble when I with the pronouns, but they like paused and they held their breath. They were waiting for this ceremony. What? Why are you taking birth control? For the panic, the parental panic. And they told me that they were so ready. I wish I could show you how they had puffed themselves up when they were telling me this. They had puffed themselves up. They were so ready to say, it's my body. I get to decide on it. You can't tell me what to do. But their father, very graciously, I must say that he said, oh, okay, cool. You good with that? Do you need anything or whatever? And it was just like, no big deal. And they let out a sigh of relief when they told me. And I told them, okay, I want you to remember right at this moment how you told me that you were ready to stand up to your father, to defend your right to your body. And I said, any other time in your life that somebody tries to dictate to you what you should do with your body, I want you to remember this moment and how you were prepared to stand up to your father. If you can stand up to your father, someone you love, someone you respect, you should be able to stand up to anybody else.
Honestly, your child is lost. I feel like, I know it's like it should be the basic thing, the minimum thing to expect from a loving parent, but it's nice to hear of experiences of how this environment of trust and encouragement and support, it really cements confidence and self-esteem in kids about things like pleasure at a time when people get so awkward about it. Yeah, I wish I had that growing up.
I wish I had it too. So my mantra is just that to be the parent that I wish I had.
Yeah, that's lovely. I guess to answer your question, Tasaffy, I feel like our ideas of pleasure shape how we view rights and what attitudes we have towards sexual and reproductive health in general, and the right to have sex also. And I think coming from a place that is war-ridden at the moment and every few years, one of the stories that I remember a lot during the Israeli war on Lebanon in 2006 is that there was a lot of concern and, let's say, shit talk between people, and maybe on TV, like some hinting at the fact that when volunteers used to go to the schools in which people who live in the south, because the aggression was very drastic in the south of Lebanon, a lot of people just moved and sought refuge in public schools and UN schools in other parts of Lebanon. And so volunteers used to go there to ask what kind of medication is needed, what kind of services are needed by the people who just moved there. And birth control was among top demands. And people just, the way people received this piece of news was horrendous. Like, how dare these people have sex and ask for birth control during a war? This can't be your priority. And I think if maybe we had more, if we had an attitude based on the right to sex and the right to pleasure for people, consensually, obviously, we don't need to draft laws or policies about pleasure. It's just our ideas on pleasure just seep into how we view these things and the attitudes we would have. And we wouldn't be discussing whether a person can and should be having sex during a war and during refuge, as if this need or this desire disappears when there is, or when sometimes there is the complete opposite, to want to have sex and intimacy and something maybe familiar or exciting when you feel like life isn't going your way in any shape or form. And another anecdote that I have is related to my work in the past as a sex educator, or as part of a group that was doing sex education in schools, is that the main reason we would be called into a school to give sex education sessions. And just to note, it is not given publicly, like we don't have public sex education classes. So it's private schools or other schools that might ask particularly for sessions from NGOs or feminist groups or health groups, etc. And most of the time we would be called into a school because either a scandal surrounding something like blackmailing over nudes, or there was whatever, again, I'm using the word scandal because it is what is usually used, but a scandal regarding sexual harassment at the school. And so we are called into these settings to discuss consent, discuss blackmailing and related issues. And we usually use that as a leeway to also discuss pleasure in a way that we do not get to do, and to discuss a sex from a consent-based approach, so that people are not, or students are not only receiving or should not be receiving just the fear-mongering part. We want to talk about consent and blackmailing in a way that centers the right to actually pursue or to engage in nudes or any form of exchange that is centered on pleasure and sexual desire, but while taking care or taking some precautions that can maybe better protect the people involved. And so I guess there are ways to introduce or maybe give information, give knowledge, have discussions away from parents with kids who do not usually have access to that kind of information, at least not contextualized, and at least not riddled with fear-mongering and the need to, or focusing on not having sex as the solution to not having blackmailing be an issue. But yeah, this is my anecdote.
Yeah, this is a conversation we end up having a lot, because we also get asked this question, like, why are we focusing on pleasure? Why is this important? And we have a lot of work that happens around women's rights, in also like discussions and advocacy around preventing gender-based violence or violence against women. And there's so much more acceptance that you talk about violence and women. But when it comes to, let's talk about women and pleasure, like the context completely changes. We've even had this kind of discussions with just women's groups, young women, where we've asked them to think about bodies, their own bodies, or just women's bodies. There was this one group that we were having this kind of a conversation with, where it was a little activity that you think about different body parts and you just share something around it. And 90% of how women talked about women's bodies, their own bodies, was about how their body is useful for someone. If they're talking about breasts, they would be like, oh, it gives nutrition to children. Or if they're talking about their vagina, then they're talking about giving birth. Or they would talk about violations of bodies. So similarly, if they're talking about breast, they're either talking about how it provides nutrition or how breasts are often stared at or harassed or grabbed without consent. No one considers thinking about their body as for themselves or just thinking about what they like about it or how they can get pleasure from it. That does not come into the conversation. So when we try to navigate and think about pleasure and ownership of their body, the conversation completely changed. And we ended up having like hours of conversation then about what they like about themselves, how they look at it. For those who had actually had sex, what they thought about it, what they wanted from it, what they didn't get from it. And it was completely a whole different conversation that we had. But the first thing that all of them thought about was how their bodies were supposed to provide something for someone else or be violated by someone else. And just this shift of thinking about pleasure, I think it's always so empowering and encouraging to see how much difference it makes just to the self about how we look at ourselves and how we think of what then we want out of our lives, out of our bodies. Yeah, I think largely this is a conversation we can keep on talking about because there's so many anecdotes and stories all the time. But just to bring our discussions to a closing, so we wanted to think about how do we envision when we are advocating around pleasure, the right to pleasure. How do you see a world? What makes a world be pleasure affirmative when you think about it? Whoever wants to go first. Maybe you can. And we also have a fun question. Sorry. We also have this fun question of if the pleasure had a color, how would you describe it? So maybe you can also add that.
Do you want to go first, Sarah? I'm okay with.
Sure. I guess a word that is pleasure affirmative to me is a word that has more nuanced conversations on sexuality and has a more nuanced approach generally, specifically within feminist spaces. I feel like we have maybe an issue. I don't know if I can call it an issue. It's very much needed, but a lot of the focus within feminist groups is on the violent aspect of sex and sexuality, which is very important, but I feel like sometimes we try to legitimize that by completely excluding other conversations that can also be centered around joy and pleasure. And it's as if, as feminists, we only think about the negative impact of the patriarchy that kind of maybe complicates and even makes us hate sex in many ways. So we focus a lot on the right to say no. We don't give much space to also how to approach the right to say yes when it comes to pleasure and joy. And I think also for me in my personal journey with my sexuality and pleasure in general, the right to say no weighed on me much harder for most of my life in a way that made me feel maybe a bit more ashamed about thinking about pleasure even as a feminist. And being able to join spaces that spoke about pleasure and consent in a joy and affirmative way helped me connect with that part of me and have access to this very important aspect of autonomy and of agency over my body and agency over my sexuality and understanding of myself. And I think also centering pleasure as, I guess, an inspiration and a source of creativity in our lives is also very important and very lovely to think about. And I'm always inspired by science fiction writer Octavia Butler, who spoke about how when she struggled with writer's block, she would always go and masturbate, and she felt like the orgasm really put her in a space of being in connection with her body and feeling a lot of euphoria and therefore creativity. And I like a word in which we can discuss that easily and see pleasure as incorporated in our daily lives and in our politics, rather than something that is always private, always discreet, always comes second to other conversations within feminists.
I'm sorry, I may have laughed too loud, Sarah. I'm sorry, but you have the best resources. I need to get that from you. I'm like, okay. And on one hand, I was like, oh, okay. So I'm not the only one who thinks that. I thought I was weird for also thinking about, okay, I need to pleasure myself a little bit to get over my writer's block. But I think I just wanted to also echo what you said, Sarah. And I think in the circles that we've worked in, I know I went into this world of sexual reproductive health rights because I was angry. I started out by telling you what the situation is for women and queer people is in the Philippines, and I was just angry. So I said, I can just sit here and fume and just, like steam away, or I can use this burning in me into something else. But I realized also that in my early years doing this as an advocate and all of that, a lot of it again was from the point of view of pain, from the point of view of shame, from the point of view of being marginalized and fighting for a space to even say that I deserve a future without pain, I deserve to not be blamed. But never in those early years did I think it was possible or permissible. I think it's a better word. I didn't think it was permissible for me to say that I don't want it, my future, my body should not just be subjected to pain, but what else? It should also enjoy pleasure. And it should also be up to me to define what that pleasure looks like, feels like, tastes like. And I'm saying that because there's also conversations about, yes, we can enjoy sex, but we also have an equal right to enjoy not having it. Or to say, no, ain't gonna happen for a bit. I'm gonna rechannel my energy somewhere else. I like this kind of narrative, this discourse so much. We're not here to shame people. Oh, if I may just cite an example, Bumble came out with an ad that said, so that should not give up dating and become celibate, something like this. And there was so much backlash. And I love it because I was like, okay, finally, because Bumble is targeted mostly at women and vulva owners, we're finally saying, okay, you can't shame me for having sex, and you can't shame me for not wanting to have sex either.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, that is the point. You ain't gonna tell me what to do and how to define what makes me happy. And I really want to see more of that conversation happening, because I think that's also premised a lot on self-determination and what you consent to. And to me, I thought about this question a lot. If pleasure had a color, to me it would be the color of the sun, yellow and orange, and then a mix of those two, how they come together to give you that feeling of warmth. I think that's what pleasure would look like to me. And I guess it's coming from now living in a country that doesn't have a lot of sun most of the year. I know how important it is and how vital it is to literally feeling alive. I cannot stay in Berlin when it's like dreary winter. So I would connect that to pleasure, because essentially it is what makes me feel alive.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. I think that's a perfect way to bring our conversation to an end. But Sarah, if you want to add something.
I just wanted to say, I think the color I associate with pleasure is pink, mainly because I'm really obsessed with the illustrations that, I don't know if they're still active, but Hola Africa, they're an organization / publication that works on pleasure, also especially in a non-heteronormative way. And a lot of their illustrations are super gorgeous, have a lot of pink, have a lot of purple. And I feel like when I think about pleasure in the creative sense, these are the colors I see.
Yeah, I think for me, I drift between two different things when I think of pleasure. One of it, I feel it's less colors, but more like something warm and bright and just something that uplifts me. But then when I really try to think of a color, a lot of times I feel I see two colors. One would be like yellow and another kind of like bright magenta thing. So it's also funny. Those are also both the colors that both of you came up with. But I feel like it's almost like magenta and yellow on top of each other. And that's how I see the colors. Maybe because they're both really bright.
But I love how our colors all had something about movement.
Yeah.
So true. Yeah, thank you so much. I think that was a fantastic discussion and it gave us so much to think about and to also take forward in how we want to create a more pleasure-oriented, pleasure-focused world for ourselves and for each other. So thank you for your time and sharing all of these little anecdotes. I feel like anecdotes give us such an idea about all the different ways, and not just us navigating these discussions, but like how, different people are thinking about a lot of these topics and actually bringing it into their own lives, into spaces that they're part of. And hopefully over this podcast would be a way for us to start having more of these conversations, just so we can see more and more of these anecdotes in all kinds of spaces. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for having us, Tasaffy. It was truly a pleasure. Sorry, I really have to say I enjoyed the conversation so much.
Thank you to Safi and Sarah. It was great to have you. I'm always up for a talk about pleasure. And I think hearing from other experiences in our different countries really also grounds me into why we need to keep doing this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.